Okay, hi everybody. So I wanted to talk today about the coronavirus, which I realise is an unusually newsworthy and current thing for this channel to deal with. But it's something that, of course, is big news at the moment, and it's something that actually in the workplace that I'm involved in is something that's had a great deal of discussion on a daily basis, of course, working in an emergency service, a fire service in my case. These things are of particular concern because these are the services that need to remain running come what may, which means that there are particularly difficult decisions to make. If you gauge it wrong and end up with too many people in that service off with it at the same time, then you can't run the service. But then if you play it too safe and you have too many people not booking in just in case, then you can end up in the same boat unnecessarily. So it's a very, very difficult decision to make. But there are some aspects of this that I wanted to talk about, really. And that is the purpose of this video. What I want to do is not to take a snapshot in time, which is the situation today, because that would make a video that is so current. This situation is changing on an almost hourly basis. It's hard to keep up with, even the numbers and everything is changing so rapidly. But to set this in some kind of concrete, this is on the day today where Donald Trump has said that in a couple of days' time that nobody will be allowed into the US from mainland Europe, or most of mainland Europe. Us in the UK can still go there, as I understand, but mainland Europe is going to be locked out. Italy has decided a series of draconian measures in Italy, of course. They're sort of further down the path. And it's interesting to look at the sort of path that they're taking. They're now closing all shops other than stores that sell food or medical supplies. Tom Hanks over in Australia has confirmed that he has the coronavirus. The NBA has suspended all its games. And then just 3/4 of an hour ago, and in some ways this is a useful entree into the things that I want to talk about here, the Republic of Ireland has decided to close all of its schools and colleges, nurseries, and all the things where young people would congregate, which is a spectacularly big call. And a spectacularly big call that they have made very early. I believe there's only one death in the Republic of Ireland so far. And it's a big call for a number of reasons, of course. There is a huge knock-on effect from that. Parents generally go to work nowadays, both parents. That's kind of the norm now. And normally when schools are closed, there is another recourse. There is somewhere else that you can send your child. You can have, in the summer holidays, you can send them to the nursery, who'll be running sort of summer groups. There is somewhere where you can parcel your child off to that allows you to go to school. It is a big call to say that those won't be open anymore. What do you do with your children? And your children have to take priority. You can't have a 7-year-old sat at home on their own, so then you can't go to work. So then potentially there are doctors and nurses, paramedics, there are police officers, there are firefighters, there are people like this, pharmacists, all these different people that you need who can no longer go to work now because they have their children sat at home. So that is a very, very big call. And it is also a big call in terms of this whole business of containment and how we manage containment. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in all of this, you may have seen something similar, was a series of graphs that had been computer modeled. And what it showed is different levels of containment and the different models to containment. And there appears to be two methodologies that you can have. That you can either try and contain it utterly, which I think we're past that point, because even if as a country, as a sovereign state, you contain it, you're at the point where you're virtually bound to get reinfected unless you could sit out in splendid isolation a significant period. So otherwise you're containing it knowing that eventually that's sort of leading then to the delay stage, because the containment sort of morphs into that, and you accept that really eventually what you're looking down the line is some form of natural immunization, and a significant percentage of the population having that natural immunization, which protects the rest of the population because it stops that individual to individual spread. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to manage that curve. And what it showed is it showed the kind of curve that you would have in an unmanaged situation entirely with this particularly large peak, which is probably the last thing that you would want, because that's the hardest thing for emergency services and vital service providers to deal with. If you can flatten that peak out, bring that peak down, spread it over a longer period of time, it becomes a lot easier to manage. Of course, it means you've got less people off at any one point in time, and it's possible to cover those things. The other requirement with regard to that is to try and fit it into the summer months, in which of course it is in the northern hemisphere, so that it doesn't fit into the peak demand on health services, to try and get it in if a substantial percentage of the population, 50 to 80% of the population, are going to go through having this virus and developing a natural immunization to it. Then if you can get it in before we get into the winter months, that is what you would like to achieve. If you have too much containment, and it showed this in a graph, and it stands to reason, then you drag the line right down and it starts to drop off. But then as soon as you take those measures out of place, of course, bang, it shoots up again. And this is what surprises me about this approach. Closing schools down so early, what is this achieving? If it's meant as a period just of short-term containment, but then you accept the fact that in 2 or 3 weeks you're going to allow children to catch it and pass it on, because let's be honest, schools are just one of those sort of hives of infection. If that's what the plan is, well, then that's one thing. But if really you're trying to contain it genuinely that way, you're going to have to keep those schools shut for months and months and months and months, not just to contain it within your nation, but to stop reinfection, because you're still open while this is an open infection around the world, unless you're going to live in splendid isolation as a state, then you're going to get reinfected again, and you won't have a population that's developed that immunization. And it appears it's probably going to be a sort of 18-month lag before we can develop something and test it and have the stocks for it to immunize people in the normal way. So it's hard to know where they go with that situation. It's also hard to know how well some of these things work, but I'll come on to that in the business that I wanted to talk about, which is effectively that this situation, in my view, is a cloud, but with a silver lining. It's probably worth talking about the cloud first, so it doesn't seem like I'm trivializing the bad side of this. It would appear the sort of smart money on this coronavirus is that about 1% of people who have the virus will die from it. The figures that we have for people who we know have it and die are significantly worse than that, in the sort of 2 to 4% region. But of course, we know that some people are developing very mild cases of it. And we know, of course, of the people that have the virus that we don't know about, that's disproportionately skewed to those that are going to have the most mild forms of it, of course. So once they take this into account, I think the 1% figure probably makes as sensible a bet as any of the ones that I have heard, but that is still a substantial number of people. In the UK alone, if everybody had it, that would be 600,000 people. They're predicting up to 80% of the population, so you're probably looking at about 450,000 people potentially having it if it plays out, and it looks as if the smart money is on that it will. So that is a significant number of people. I recall seeing a couple of Italians who were visiting the Vatican, which was still open to the public, sort of brushing this off. And I don't want to criticize them too harshly, but they were sort of saying, we're young, at our age, if we get it, doesn't really matter, we'll be okay. But of course, that's the naivety of youth. The reality is, it's not just what happens to us, it's what happens to those people we come into contact with, those people that we care about. And some of the tragedies, some of the cloud, won't just be the people that die, but the sense of responsibility that some people feel for the people that die. I'm in a situation where my mother turns 80 years old within a couple of weeks, and there may well come a period as we head towards that peak where she wishes to isolate, and I might be the person who says, look, I'll get you your groceries in and I'll bring them round. And if she gets that infection, then it might be because I've done something wrong. And if I can pinpoint that, then I'm going to feel a sense of guilt, a sense of responsibility for having infected my 80-year-old mother who has COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. I could be the person who is responsible for her death. And how many people, how often is that going to have been iterated, that kind of situation around the world, by the time this reaches a conclusion? These are all personal tragedies for families and for individuals, and I don't want to sort of whitewash over that. But there is a silver lining to this, I think, looking at it more brutally, and that this is not a zombie apocalypse situation, despite the people who are going out there panic buying unnecessarily, because there are things that could have been this that would have justified some of that panic buying, quite frankly. We have had other major infections that the same initial scares have gone out that have substantially higher mortality rates than this, that have amounted to nothing. It's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that you could have had an infection that got out into the system in the way that this has, that had a mortality rate of 25%, of 50%, of 60%, and then the shit really would hit the fan, wouldn't it? And I can't help but think that in some ways it's kind of lucky. This is the first time that some of the doom mongering and some of the sort of worst case predictions have come true. And some of those plans that we have had, there have been other bad infections, but before the sort of modern plans have been put into place is what I'm saying. Since those plans have been put into place in the last few decades, this is the first time we've had something quite like this. And those plans are being tested. In some cases they're working, in some cases they are not. And I think we may well look back on this period, on all this has happened here, and feel that, and it's quite a good thing really, because one thing that often happens when a tragedy occurs, even when it's a personal tragedy, is if some good can come of it. Your child has died, but their organs have been able to be passed on. This happened, but we've learned as a society so that no other child will ever experience this again, etc., etc. And maybe people will look back at this, people who lose loved ones will think we've actually learned quite a lot, and I think we will learn a lot. Things are cropping up already, even before all this has gone through the wash. I watched last night in the Champions League, Liverpool lose to Atletico Madrid, quite unfortunately in actual fact. But going on at the same time, Paris Saint-Germain were playing Borussia Dortmund in Paris behind closed doors. That game, for the sake of the public, they kept the crowds outside of the stadium. They were playing in an empty stadium. And we all saw these pictures of huge crowds in Paris gathered, watching the game, celebrating, supporting PSG. Doing all the things that they would have been doing inside the stadium, just outside the stadium. And indeed, people have pointed out in the UK, if we start playing games behind closed doors, and these games are shown in the pubs and bars of the United Kingdom, then rather than some of these supporters congregating in what is effectively an open air environment, those same supporters will be congregating in pubs and bars, which is surely a worse environment. They're now in the same kind of tightly clustered environments, but now indoors and perhaps more likely to infect one another. It cannot simply be a case of just passing the buck on. Well, we've done our bit so that nobody's getting infected in our stadium, if in fact what that's leading to is a greater number of infections somewhere down the line. I think the lessons that we are going to learn with regard to the ways that we've tried to tackle it and the different approaches is something that maybe down the line, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, could be of such immeasurable importance that they literally could stop an infection similar to this, but an order of magnitude worse in terms of the infectability or in terms of mortality rates, and maybe that information could stand us in good stead. Okay, thoughts? Interested to know what you think about the different approaches that are being taken, what we can do different in the future. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye for now.